enough to eat. We are now coming to our last panel of the conference. We've had a wonderful 2 days, and we now, unfortunately, are coming to panel number 6, which is also set to be a great panel. The title of this panel is State Use of Food as a Weapon and Its Consequences. And our speakers today will be Bohdan Klid, Maksym Snihyr, who will be joining us via Zoom, Antanas Terleckas, and Andriy Kohut, who also will be joining us by Zoom. And Michael Ellman will be giving comments on the papers after the speakers give their presentations. And just a reminder that each speaker will have 15 minutes to give their talk. That way we can have enough time for comments and also for a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I will introduce Bohdan Klid as the first speaker.
Thank you, John. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this, I think, well-organized event, and all of the people who have come to present papers and have come to Cambridge. And I'd also like to thank Helena, my spouse, for helping me with the PowerPoint presentation and also with the tables and in collecting and actually doing some very important research for me in collecting some of the data. So, and finally, I'd like to thank the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. I'm the director of research, but I don't control the purse strings. So, on 10th of June, 1932, could I have the first slide? Or do I, okay, I do that here, correct?
You can use also keys on your computer.
On the top? Okay. Okay, there's an arrow here, no? This one? I've hit several buttons, so I'm just not.
You can just use the computer.
Okay. Where do I do that?
You can just use the space bar.
Okay, sure. Right here, right?
The space bar. Right this
The space bar, okay, got it. Okay. Good. Okay, on the June 10th, 2 letters from Ukraine's top government officials were sent to Joseph Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov. One was from Vlas Chubar, who headed the Soviet government, the Ukrainian government that is, and the other from Hryhorij Petrovsky, who was actually Ukraine's head of state and an old Bolshevik. The paper here is based on, or stems from Petrovsky's letter, and I'd like to quote from it. I was in many rayon villages and saw a considerable part of the countryside engulfed in famine. During meetings at villages, I am yelled at for nothing. Old women cry and men also. At times, the criticism of the situation goes very deep. Why did they create an artificial famine? After all, we had a harvest. Why did they take away the sowing seeds? That did not happen even under the old regime. Why should Ukrainians make treacherous journeys for bread to non-grain producing areas? Why isn't grain being brought here? And so on. Now, I read this document ages ago, but when you, after time and maybe age, and after doing a bit of reading, you begin to look at things a little bit differently the second or third time you read the same document. And that's what happened with me, and that's what caused me to prepare this presentation. And the questions asked, of course, are rhetorical questions. And it's a rhetorical question that Petrovsky inserts in the letter to Stalin and Molotov. So obviously it irritated, I think, Stalin, and he mentions that in the letter to Kaganovich. I can talk about that in the question and answer period. I want to go on further. Petrovsky goes on. It's difficult to provide explanations under the circumstances. You obviously condemn those who committed excesses, but generally feel like a Crucian carp squirming in a frying pan. In response for the desperate cry for relief, for sowing seeds and grain for food, I promised something with regard to sowing seeds, but told the farmers to find seed in their own region. Concerning grain for food relief, I cannot promise anything or very little. Because of the general famine, as we know, an elemental migration, he uses the term movement, of the village has occurred, which I've added, to the Dno station, the central Black Earth Oblast province, and the North Caucasus. In some cases, 2/3 of all men have left their villages in search of bread. At the Dno station, grain is 30 to 40 rubles a pud. A pud is 16.38 kilos. But here, probably in Ukraine, in Terleckas, or where he was writing, or Kharkiv, it is 100 to 140 per pud. I'd suggested promoting the idea of organized trips for grain, but tickets are not being issued to villagers or very limited numbers. Peasants have asked, why are trips prohibited? End quote. So all of these questions come up in one letter, and it comes at a time, a critical time, June 1932. So I'm going to go on and provide some examples. What do we mean by this mass migration or mass exodus? Petrovsky mentions that 2/3 of all men in a particular region have left. There are all kinds of documents or references that one can find here. And there's and most of them are published. A Komsomol member and worker from the Central Black Earth region writes, each day throughout all of our district, whole caravans of hungry Ukrainian peasants, collective farmers, and individual farmers are traveling, bartering their belongings for any kind of piece of bread, that is clothing, shoes, whatever they have. Another example. Mykola Demchenko, who's an Oblast secretary, Kyiv Oblast secretary, while visiting a collective farm in the village of Zhashkiv, writes that most men, in his letter he writes, there are almost no collective farmers, men left at all, had left for Belarus and Leningrad province. The head of the collective farm work brigade, he was told, had left the station Dno for grain. His replacement was reported to have left as well. Now one can imagine how well that collective farm was able to work with all these people, all these men primarily who do the heavy work are gone, right? On 3 May, the USSR's Deputy Commissar of Agriculture, Granevich, reported 28,000 had left out of a population of about 100,000 in Zinovyevsk district. A GPU report from July 1932 estimates that 50% of the population had left in some districts. The report gave the figure of 116,000 having left their villages in 21 districts of Ukraine. Kulchitsky later estimated, extrapolating from that number, that up to 3 million people were on the move in Ukraine during this period. That's the first half of 1932, I would say. I could give more examples. I will briefly note what Andrew Cairn, who was the director he worked for the Empire Marketing Board here in London. Every station had its crowd, from scores to several hundred, depending on the size of the town, of rag-clad, hungry peasants, some begging for food, many waiting, mostly in vain, for tickets, many climbing onto the steps or joining the crowds on the roof of each car, all filthy and miserable and not a trace of a smile anywhere. He continues, at every station, hundreds of peasants were fighting to get into the train or onto the roof, couplings and steps. Every station we passed had its hundreds to thousands of miserable, hungry people, and every train we passed was crowded inside and out with most unhappy-looking citizens. So anyway, you get the picture. Now, I'm going to go on to, I've got more in my text, but I don't have the time, so I'll go on. What do we have here? We have here from Wheatcroft and Davies, the grain issued to kolkhoz able collective farmers 1931 to 33. As you can see, if you compare with collective farmers in other regions of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian farmers are being paid considerably less than other farmers. Go on, whoops. Next graph from Davies Wheatcroft. And this is an interesting one as well. This is the bazaar prices for rye flour. Now, the red is the two Ukrainian cities. One is Kyiv, the other is Dnipropetrovsk. If one compares prices in 1932, various times, to and also 1933, but we're only talking about 1932 here, you'll see consistently Ukrainian prices are higher. Simplified graph. Bazaar prices in, we have there, it's hard to tell from here, but December 31, you notice the prices are fairly even, but then we go into 1932 and you see the prices jump, right? June, the prices jump in Ukraine. So the prices are consistently higher in Ukraine, at least preliminarily. This is what we find. Andrew Cairns, being a good bureaucrat, he collected prices, and I have so many prices from Cairns, but we've tried to simplify the graph, the chart here, and we're only looking at, I'm only giving figures of that can be compared to the other figures, prices per pud or per kilogram. And again, we see the prices in Ukraine are what Cairns calls fantastic. Now, prices in Russia are higher as well, but they are lower. Oops. More data from Italian consul's report and diaries. And this is all preliminary, but I just, because I was working on this paper quickly, and I knew that some of this existed and some of it was found by Helena. And from the diaries, you can see the prices that were noted by Ukrainian peasant. And the Italian consul noted that the price of wheat brought a premium price. So the consul, I think, gives a price of, what is it there? It's hard to see it on the screen here. And my eyesight's failing, so I have a hard time reading here. But one gets the idea of how high the prices were in Ukraine. Now, what caused the high prices? What caused the dearth of grain in Ukraine? That caused the prices to go up because, as we know from Economics 101, where there's a good supply and the demand is low, or let's say normal, you would have normal prices. And where the demand is high or where the supply is scarce, you have high prices. And in my paper, I give some reasons for this related to the collection of grain. And that's the most important reason. Ukraine was being stripped of grain. A lot of grain was taken in 1930, 7.7 million tons, I think. In 1931, the collection continued into the spring of 1932, and the state was only able to get 7.2 million. Anyway, it's a considerable amount of grain. But a factor that really hasn't been taken into account is Molotov's mission to Ukraine, December 31 to January 32. In late December, Molotov was sent to Ukraine. He attends a Politburo meeting and he forces, and I use the word forces in, let's say gently forces, the Ukrainian Politburo, or convinces them, or as Wheat Cross Davies right here, they put some backbone into the Ukrainian Politburo to intensify grain collection efforts in Ukraine. So Ukraine was short on the grain collection target. Only 6.7 out of 8.36 were collected. The grain was desperately needed by the state. Don't say anything about the peasants who are starving, of course. It's crucial to obtain it from Ukraine. Molotov was dispatched to Kharkiv. Well, I said that already. The amount owed by Ukraine was small. Moscow's alarm that Ukraine was lagging was understandable. They note later on that 400,000 tons were collected in Ukraine just in January 32, which constituted 40% of the total collected in the USSR. What does Kolchetsky write? Molotov, a little different sort of approach to the problem, I would say. Molotov was sent to take direct control of grain collections. This is the first time this was done, and in Ukraine particularly. This presaged the extraordinary grain commissions of the fall of 1932. So this is kind of like a test case. Molotov's mission to Kharkiv deserves special attention. He emphasizes the resolution of Ukraine's Politburo meeting and Mikhaenko's telegram to Molotov of 1 January 32. Both these documents are published in Tragedia Sovietskoy Derevny. Mikhaenko from the Zinovets city reported to Molotov that they passed a resolution based on the Ukrainian Politburo's Central Committee's, the Politburo of the Central Committee's resolution and Molotov's directives at a meeting. At that meeting, Molotov apparently told the plenipotentiaries to collect, assign the quantities of grain that they were to collect in that district, authorized seed confiscations if collective farms did not meet their quota, and grain found on such farms could be considered stolen or squandered and subject to confiscation if the farm had not fulfilled its plan. Molotov demanded the taking of grain from Ukraine, and this is Kolchetsky, with no concern for the morrow. A little different interpretation, I would say. I'm sorry?
Time is running out.
Okay, I will be done in two to 3 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So at this Politburo meeting, there were two other decisions taken. And here I mention these decisions. One of them was a special instructional meeting was called for January the 2nd of 200 officials from all over Ukraine. So they were called into Kharkiv. Apparently this meeting was held and then they were sent back to the districts to finish their grain collection. You can imagine what was told to them at that time. Um, I won't have time to go into the grain loans or the relief, but this is a problem that is connected to my paper. And my basic thesis here is that loans to Ukraine were given later than loans to other regions of Russia. And if you look at the breakdown of the aid in the form of loans to Ukraine, you'll see that most of it was for seed. Very, very little was for food. And I broke down the amount of grain that was given as loans. And if you compare that to what was taken in January, there's a huge, huge difference, right? I think the amount loaned for food was about 26,000 tons. The amount taken from Ukraine was 400,000 just in January of 1932. Go further. And again, I don't have time to explain this, so I can do it in the discussion period. So the other decision that was taken at the 29 Politburo meeting, which is not here, or I must have missed it on the PowerPoint presentation, was 12 million poods of wheat was to be transferred north from Ukraine in January of 1932. And this was a special decision taken by the Politburo. It wasn't part of their agreements, or so to speak, plan. It was an extra sort of, I think, levy upon Ukraine. So the question that comes from that is, Ukraine was obviously treated as a milking cow, to put it mildly. And then in addition, in December of 31, January 32, you have this additional sort of pressure put on Ukraine as a result of Malta's visit. And one of the results was 12 million poods of wheat is shipped north, which was in Ukraine, or was supposed to be in Ukraine. That's as much as I can see. So the conclusions, obviously here, the 22 January directive of blockading Ukraine in the North Caucasus is referred to. You have in the directives itself the mass flight of peasants for bread in 1932. Stalin's 18 June letter to Kaganovich in Malta, which I mentioned in my paper, but I didn't have time to talk about here. It's referred to often to support the genocide interpretation. We have to think about what the relationship of the bazaar prices, grain availability, and the 1932, what I call a great exodus were. We don't really know how many people were involved in this exodus. I think Kuchitsky's is a preliminary estimate, but work needs to be done there. But it's a heck of a lot of people were on the move in 1932. Molotov's mission, again, and the decisions of the Politburo of December 29, with cheap pressure to make them. And then the regional differences and the delay in seed, food, and forage loans to Ukraine. How do we explain that? Here I mention it. 175,000 tons of assistance was third among Soviet regions. 26,000 tons were for food, which feeds so many number of people. The total aid and loans was less than one half of what was collected in January 1932. Food loan was 13.3%, and what was authorized to ship, and 13.3% of what was authorized to ship north in January of 32. 6.55% of the total amount collected in January of 1932. So what really needs to be, I think, looked at further is the central control of grain collections, the internal flows and distribution of grain within the Soviet Union, the key to understanding food availability, prices, and famine. Thank you.
I'm going to share the screen. First of all, thank you for the privilege to discuss my findings. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So, people would constantly cross the borders, regarding of the relations between the countries, the legality of the crossing, or the brutality of the policing of those said borders. Romania and the Soviet Union were in a constant state of the diplomatic conflict over the question of belonging of the Bessarabia province, in which both sides were using both propaganda and the intelligence. Despite this permanent tension, population of both of those countries would still move over the border throughout the whole interwar period. According to Vadim Guzun, after the height of the migration during the 1919 to 1922, the movement of population would remain comparatively low. After the start of the collectivization, however, the change of scope would happen, largely due to the reason of that the threat of the deportations have arisen in the Soviet Union. According to Igor Kashu, 600 to 800 of people were deported from the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic to the northern areas of the USSR in 1930 alone. So throughout 1931, Romanian authorities would register around 500 refugees in Bessarabia who would try to find the refuge in Romania from the collectivization and the subsequent threat of the deportation. The refugees from the Soviet Union were not a monolithic entity. They were consisted of several groups, largely divided by the ethnic lines in the spirit of the time. So also the relief organizations would be divided along those ethnic lines, even though in this region the ethnic division would be at the very least quite blurry. Out of those groups, Moldovans would be in the best position, largely due to the ability to communicate with the Romanian state in one language. In addition, among the earlier waves of the refugees came the members of the Romanian intelligentsia who have managed to acquire the connections with the Soviet state. Among those people was Nikitas Mochine, who together with the former minister for Bessarabia, Pantelimon Khalipa, have created the Committee for the Help of the Transnistrian Moldovans in 1921. In this presentation, I would like also discuss the movement of the population itself, but I would limit myself to the so-called Holinessed sector of the border of the Romanian border guards, different here in Romanian. It would encompass basically the border area of the Soviet Union with the interwar district of Cetatea Albă, and the reports of the border posts to the prefectura of the police in Cetatea Albă, modern-day Bilhorod-Dnistrovski, would constitute the vital part of the source base of this research paper. So it's basically an area from the Liman at the south east to the villages Purcari and Reskelec to the northwest of the area. Romanian border guards have registered 87 cases throughout 1932, they would register 87 cases with 472 people fleeing. These cases could be divided into two large groups. Larger group would constitute the areas, border areas from the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and the smaller one, considerably smaller one, would be from the Odessa region of the Soviet Ukraine. Separately, I highlighted the rest of cases which would either be unspecified or the cases in which people would flee from the areas beyond the immediate border areas. Majority of people who would be fleeing were peasants, but there were also few exceptions. For example, on 26th of February, the border police would report that Teodosy Lagnis from Kyiv has crossed the river, and as a reason why he decided to cross the border, he reported that he used to be an officer of the Tsarist military participating in the anti-communist movement, and he was certain that the communists would try to arrest him and deport to Siberia. On July 27th, a soldier of the 26th Border Guard Squad of the Soviet Border Force, Prokopy Chernyakov, who was born in 1909 in the Ural area, has surrendered to the border guards on the Romanian side of Dniester. About the cases of the flights, if we would look at the cases month per month, it is possible to notice that the height of the fleeing was happening in the spring period from March through May, and after that it was decreased. I believe that the decrease happened because in June of the 1932, the Soviet border guards were increasing the use of force. So in the Romanian border guards, there would appear the reports on the bodies found and the bullet shots and the movements of the border guards on the Soviet side of the river. But it was the second time during which the Soviet border guards would apply the force in the Sectoral Holinessed. The first one would be can you see the slides now? I'm sorry.
Maksym, I don't think we see them, that you are changing the
dear.
slides. We can see the first slide, but I don't think we can see that you are changing the slides.
I would try to stop.
At least on my screen also online.
I would try to stop sharing and share. Now you can see that it's the PowerPoint, right?
Yes,
Okay.
now it's better.
Okay, but it's
PowerPoint though.
maybe.
If you start the PowerPoint show for us, Maksym.
Yes. Now, can you see the table?
No.
No. Oh, there. I don't know the reason, so unfortunately, you would need to believe me on word that there are numbers and such. So anyway, the first case of the application of the force would be the Holinessed Massacre, about which Igor Kashu has already stated, but I would repeat that on 23rd to 24th of February, a group of 62 peasants from the village Terleckas in the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic have tried to cross the border from the Soviet Ukraine into Romania. When they decided to cross the river, the Soviet post of the border guards, under the light of the signal rockets, have started to gun down the refugees on ice, and afterwards has used the grenades. Newspapers and early reported about 18 people, but later it was corrected to be 23 people. A lot of them had the gunshot wounds, and everyone was in the state of the undescribable misery due to the exhaustion. Romanian society has responded to these events by the outrage. Ukrainian and Romanian political organizations have tried to host protests in Bucharest, Chernivtsi, and Chisinau. The female organizations of Romania, together with the together with Bessarabian Metropoli, have presented a joint appeal to the International Council of Women in the League of Nations, in which they asked Romanian side to add the question of the refugees in the agenda of the negotiations with the frontier. On February 26, the debates have started in the lower house of the Romanian parliament, and one of the members of the parliament, Bosnian Paraschivescu, a member of the National Liberal Party with the ties to the far-right movement, has offered to negotiate a population exchange to the present there, Minister of the Interior, Constantin Argetoianu. Argetoianu stated during those debates that the Romanian government has no power in the interfering in the situation, mainly because it was the inner business of the Soviet Union since they held the Soviet passports, they held the Soviet citizenship. In March 1932, the Committee for Help to the Transnistrian Moldovans has sent the appeal to the League of Nations and stated the importance of the protection of the Moldovan population, which was endangered by the acts of the Soviet officials. A few days later, the question of the refugees was debated in the Senate, in Romanian Senate, where it was discussed in the presence of the Prime Minister Nicolae Iorga. Iorga described and condemned those barbaric acts, the most brutal acts which are resembling the acts from 13th century, but ultimately stated that Romanian government has no instruments on pressuring the Soviets, mainly because they don't have the bilateral ties with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is not a member of the League of Nations. Nonetheless, Romania should protest those barbaric acts via the League of Nations. After few massacres, another few massacres on the border, the member of the Romanian Senate from Bukovina, Denis Maier-Michalski, has presented an appeal to the Speaker of the Senate and the Minister of the Interior, in which he urged Romanian government not to deport people back to the USSR because they would be tortured there by the hardest tortures of the OGPU, including also Ukrainians. He recited that he knows at least about one case of a refugee who was returned by the Romanian side into the Soviet Union. In May, another appeal signed by the head of the Committee for the Help of Transnistrian Moldovans, Pantelimon Halipa, appeared in the Senate. And the authors would stress that the life on the left bank of Dniester has turned for worse, that they have created a sham statehood in Moldova just in order to rise another generation of the Moldovan communists, which would turn the weapons against their Romanian brothers and such. But that propaganda was unable to hide the facts of the expropriations of the products of work of the peasants and the mass deportations, which were lasting for 3 years already. Mentioning the massacre, adding another massacre which happened in Tigina near today present-day Bandere, authors would refer in this way. Where are those Henry Torres and Henry Bardus who would know how to protest and when to start their protests in the name of the universal humanism when a single hair would fall off from the heads of the communists? Wasn't it enough to hear the laments of the poor Moldovans from the Soviet Bank of Dniester? They don't study as foreign journalists, the Moldovans fleeing their lives. We are waiting impatiently for the protests in Geneva, London, Paris, New York, in all the parliaments, in all human rights organizations. In this way, authors were rhetorically combating the political campaign against the Romanian government's brutal suppression of the communist-inspired and incited Tatar-Hunar uprising in 1934. In this situation, Moldovan and Ukrainian relief organizations would be natural allies in a question of attracting the attention of the international community to the events in the Soviet Ukraine. So the talks have happened in the next year, 1933, in February, between Nikita Smokina and the head of the Ukrainian Immigrational Committee, Alexander Shulgin, in the building of the Trizov newspaper in Paris. Talks have lasted for approximately 5 hours. Mainly, they were discussing the question of, citing Nikita Smokina's diary, Ukrainian situation of tomorrow and Transnistrian Romanians. In his diary, Smokina states that Shulgin's Aide Kosenko offered to Smokina to publish the Ukrainian and Moldovan material on the famine and the events in Soviet Ukraine in one volume. Smokina, however, declined the offer, saying that personally to me, this is not beneficial. However, he would help his Ukrainian allies with printing the Ukrainian brochures in the printer in the university printing press in Iași. So to conclude, majority of the refugees in this area were peasants from the border villages feeling the threat of the deportation. Romanian government knew the reasons people were fleeing the Soviet Union, but the government was reluctant to help, even under the pressure of the society. However, Romanian intellectual elites would not hesitate the usage of the problem and the question of the refugees as a propaganda tool. Thank you for the attention.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here and allow me to briefly expand the geographical borders of this conference. In the history of famine in the Soviet Union, Lithuania does not make the cut as a relevant case study. The agricultural crisis in Lithuania in 1954 to 1956 did not cause a famine, only a quite severe case of food shortage. Nevertheless, I believe that there are 3 aspects that make this historical period particularly interesting. First of all, we are talking about years after Stalin's death, when the Soviet world was supposed to transform, to abandon the use of terror. Malenkov's economic reforms were supposed to boost the agriculture, and yet somehow a whole Soviet republic ended up on the brink of famine. And here I must briefly apologize to the discussant, because in the submitted version of this paper, I gave credit for these reforms to Anastasas Mikoyan for whatever reason, not Malenkov, which is a silly mistake, and I'm not really sure how it could have happened. Second reason is the fact that the Communist Party had nothing to gain from this crisis. They were not trying to create an artificial famine, as in the case of Ukraine, to crush a whole nation or to force collectivization, but quite the opposite. We tried to solve it. Finally, this crisis did not happen during collectivization, but rather a few years after. After the Second World War, Lithuania became somewhat of a shelter for people that faced famine elsewhere, namely the German street children from East Prussia, or Wolfskinder, and various people from the Soviet Union during the 1946-1947 famine in the Soviet Union. These people ceased to come to Soviet Lithuania almost as soon as collectivization began here in 1948, although obviously not for this reason only. In late 1951, Soviet authorities declared that socialism in Lithuania has been built, which meant that collectivization had ended as well. Armed anti-Soviet resistance was eliminated. The members of the resistance, along with their families and kulaks, were either killed, arrested, and sent to gulag camps or simply deported to Siberia. It is estimated that around 350,000 people became victims of the Stalinist terror in Lithuania alone, which makes up for more than 10% of the total population of Lithuania in 1940. It was the time to build the prosperous Soviet society, but year after year, party officials were complaining that various problems were slowing down the development of agriculture. In April 1954, in the plenum of the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party, the head of the party, Antanas presented a very long list of problems in the countryside, but remained somewhat optimistic. He concluded that, that in the last few years, the overall situation in collective farms has improved and the public sector of the farms has become stronger. In reality, Lithuanian agriculture was struggling, even more than Latvian or Estonian agriculture, despite the fact that Lithuania was the most agrarian out of these three Baltic countries, with 80% of the total population working in agriculture back in independent Lithuania in 1939, and still 53% working there according to the first Soviet-era census of 1959. People were struggling to adapt to the life in collective farms because the pay for work days was miserable, and with each year the harvests were smaller, and Soviet authorities constantly complained that kolkhozniki are either always late to work or do not come at all, especially women. A trigger that almost caused the entire agrarian sector to collapse was unfavorable weather conditions in 1954, a very dry summer and a very rainy autumn. But these conditions alone could have never caused these problems, as people were simply disinterested and reluctant to work in kolkhozy. In July, storms hit the countryside, destroyed crops, kolkhozy were forced to ask for compensations, and so on and so on. In autumn, people were not able to harvest because the land and the crops were too wet, and tractors and horses struggled on the wet land. And as a result, very little fodder was prepared before winter, thus creating an imminent danger for the most important sector of the Soviet Lithuania's agriculture, that is animal husbandry. Already in September of 1954, the situation in Lithuania attracted attention from Moscow. In the September 30th issue of Pravda, an article was published by the title, "Why is LSSR lagging behind with agricultural work?" In this article, a correspondent that has supposedly visited various collective farms in Lithuania concludes that the Communist Party of Lithuania, the Central Committee, and the Council of Ministers is to blame. This article was discussed in the Politburo meeting of the Lithuanian Communist Party, and the typical Soviet-era declaration was made. We agree that we made mistakes, and we are to overcome these difficulties. However, the measures that were supposed to be implemented seemed somewhat desperate. The Politburo decided to simply send more manpower to the countryside, either short-term or long-term. In this particular case, we decided to send 1,250 party and Soviet functionaries to the countryside from the cities, ordered Rayon-level authorities to find even more activists to send to the collective farms, and decided to send another 7,600 people that were working in various factories and other institutions on a 15-day mission to the countryside to help with the harvest. Obviously, this influx of people could not immediately solve the problems that had accumulated in the last 5 years. Therefore, the harvests of 1954 and especially 1955 were catastrophic. There were some cases when harvests were even smaller than what collective farms had sown, making agriculture essentially an unprofitable activity. According to official Soviet data, which is not at all reliable in this case, in 1954, the overall harvest of crops was 730 tons in Lithuania and only 424 tons in 1955. In comparison, in 1939, the overall harvest in Lithuania was 1,820 tons, so it was 4.5 times bigger than what was than in 1955. Although it should be noted that the focus of the Soviet authorities changed and they were more focused on animal husbandry rather than crop production, nonetheless, it does mean that 10 years after the end of the Second World War, Lithuanian agriculture was nowhere near the pre-war levels. What was even worse was the situation with farm animals, because not enough fodder was prepared for the upcoming winter, although there were many problems as well. There are many documents portraying the conditions of these animals, the farm buildings without a roof, without any windows, without sometimes even a floor. And various memoirs, there are various testimonies about the horrific state of animals kept in the kolkhoz farms, how animals were so weak during this time that they had to be tied by ropes to the walls, because if they fell, they would simply die. Even Soviet historiography recognized that the overall number of farm animals in Soviet Lithuania dropped slightly during these years. However, statistical data that was used both in historiography and in various reports at the time is once again unreliable. Therefore, we have to rely on other historical sources to understand just how bad the situation in agriculture was. One testimony that is particularly eye-opening was published in 1971 under Brezhnev in the memoirs of a quite successful medium-level politician of the LSSR. He writes how he became a chairman of a kolkhoz in 1954 and how he inspected the situation in the farms with the livestock upon his arrival. According to him, there was virtually nothing left to feed the animals with, despite the fact that the whole winter was still ahead of them. And the animals were in very poor condition, and he came up with a solution. He ordered to slaughter the horses of a collective farm and to feed their meat to the pigs, and then to give these pigs away to the kolkhoznik. This way he diminished the amount of animals he had to feed, and thus organized some fodder for the kolkhoz. The censor of these memoirs did not cross out a single word in this passage. Therefore, it means that it was not something that could be of shock or something suspicious in the Soviet society. And this was a rather interesting censor, because he did not allow on another passage to portray a teacher, a member of the intelligentsia, to be portrayed as working barefooted in his private garden. However, such a solution was against the Soviet laws at the time, because during collectivization, people were reluctant to give up their animals to the kolkhoz and then simply slaughtered them. As a result, it was forbidden to slaughter or sell animals without the approval of the Zoo Veterinary Commission. Therefore, it should not come as a surprise that nowhere in the minutes of this particular kolkhoz meetings does it say anything about slaughtering horses and feeding them to the pigs. Only that the kolkhoz has decided to sell nearly half of its livestock in the middle of winter for whatever reason. From various party documents of 1954 and 1955, we see that party officials would complain about the fact that kolkhozy and kolkhozniki, when faced with a lack of fodder, would simply slaughter their animals or sell them in the market. In 1955, the weather conditions were once again unfavorable, and in many cases starved cows would not give any milk until June. Due to the poor harvest, many farms were struggling to gather enough seeds for the sowing. Kolkhoz or even rayon officials would write to the Central Committee asking where they could buy some grain seeds or potatoes. Due to the lack of seeds and the low quality of work in 1955, sown areas in kolkhozy decreased by 200,000 hectares, or 20 to 30% of the total cultivated land in Lithuania. According to official data, in the span of 12 months from January 1st, 1955, the overall number of farm animals in the public sector, in the collective farms and state farms, dropped by around 20%. However, judging by various reports that were sent to the Central Committee, it seems that in reality these numbers could be much higher. Moreover, the sheer numbers do not reflect the overall well-being of these animals. It should be clear that the Lithuanian agriculture was barely functioning at the time. However, it is very difficult to estimate just what sort of effect this had on the society. There is very little research done on the topic of collectivization in Lithuania, especially regarding as to what happened after the end of collectivization. Therefore, a lot of angles of research that could show the effect of this agricultural crisis on the society are still not done yet, and I am only able to give an overview and not an in-depth analysis. We know for a fact that the worst situation was in the second largest city in Lithuania, Kaunas, most likely in state institutions like kindergartens and orphanages especially. There was a notable increase in the spread of diseases in Kaunas, especially scarlet fever, polio, and various intestinal diseases, and questionable statistical data shows a spike of some diseases around Lithuania during these years, however, a decrease of others. The crisis in agriculture also coincides with one of the biggest political upturns in the history of Soviet Lithuania as well. In November 1955, a longtime chairman of the Lithuanian Council of Ministers, one of the most influential political figures of Lithuania during Stalinist years, Mečislovas Gedvilas, was removed from office and humiliated. He was forced to study in the higher party school in Moscow when he was already 54 years of age and being in office ever since the Soviet occupation in 1940. Although there were tensions between him and Sniečkus prior to this, in 1955, he was chosen as the scapegoat for the situation the Lithuanian agriculture was in. According to a Lithuanian historian Vytautas Tininis, Sniečkus was particularly offended by the fact that Gedvilas in 1955 went to Moscow himself, met with Lazar Kaganovich, and got him to agree to help the Lithuanian agriculture. When he came back, supposedly rumors spread that only Gedvilas is looking after Lithuania's economy and Lithuanians in general, whereas Sniečkus is only interested in party affairs. Sniečkus went to Moscow himself and got the Central Committee to agree with the removal of Gedvilas from office. Although the crisis in agriculture was most likely not the only reason for Gedvilas' removal from the office, it was used as a plausible pretext. Another aspect that shows the turmoil that was happening at the time is the fact that, especially in 1955, the KGB had their hands full trying to control the various rumors that were spreading all around Lithuania. These waves of rumors would happen throughout the Soviet era, obviously, but there was a huge increase in February and March of 1955. The main rumor was that a war between the West and the Soviet Union is imminent, with various interpretations as to what's it gonna mean. This rumor was heard by the KGB in 81 out of the total 87 rayons in Lithuania, and amongst the kolkhozniki, it was usually interpreted as a sign of the imminent abolition of the collective farms. Therefore, we don't need to actually work, and we can start preparing for the division of farm animals and other goods. Coming to an end, towards the end of 1955, plenty of decrees, both local level and Moscow level, were made that were supposed to jumpstart this half-dead economy of Lithuania. Kolkhozy debts to the state were written off. Finally, the weather got better. Some of the taxations were uplifted. Farms that were lagging behind were transformed into either state farms or sovkhozy, or connected with other stronger collective farms. However, what saved Lithuania from a total upheaval was not the help from the Soviet Union or these various decrees, but the fact that years after collectivization had ended, the agricultural sector in Lithuania was still heavily relying on individual farming. According to official Soviet data, in 1954 in Lithuania, income from kolkhoz itself, from the communal sector, constituted only 17% of a kolkhoznik's total yearly income, whereas 75% was still generated in the tiny private allotments of 60 years where the peasant could work individually. In 1955, only around 36% of cattle and 25% of pigs belonged to the public sector, whereas the rest was still in the quote-unquote private hands. Individual farming was still giving much better results, and it compensated for some of the problems that the public sector faced. I can only once again remind you of the memoirs of the kolkhoz chairman that I mentioned before. What did he do? He gave his farm animals from the public sector away to the kolkhozniki because it was the most efficient way to solve his problems. People were able to sell their production in the markets, thus gaining some income and providing food and groceries for people living in the cities. Which, yeah, just the final sentence, which in turn means that the most efficient way to solve the problems of socialism on Soviet agrarian sector was to rely on individuals and their free will. Thank you.
Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to talking with you about topics related to the Holodomor and how we can a set of different role and involving of the one of the most crucial institution from Soviet era. I mean the state security. I hope that my presentations is okay and you saw the presentations.
Yeah, we can see.
So thanks. So if we start talking about the role of state security or secret services during Soviet times, of course, when we're talking about Holodomor times, the one of the crucial and important executors of this crime, it was Soviet secret services. When we're talking about 1932-33, it's I mean state political administration or Главное политическое управление, or GPU in Russians. Of course, how they was involved in Holodomor, into organizing this Holodomor and other issues, of course, better to show when we try to analyze archival documents. And if we mention all this archival evidence about the role of the state security or secret services or secret police, of course, first of all, we need to analyze and assess the informations what preserved in the archives of so-called KGB archives. Of course, it's include not only collections from KGB times, but also another structures and another institutions, the predecessors of KGB. When you're talking about Ukrainian Soviet Republic, it means that all these collections, documents, what was preserved at the end of 80s in the KGB archives, now preserved in the security service archive in Kyiv and in regions also. When we're talking about Kyiv, it's around 7 kilometers or more than 224,000 files and over than 800,000 files in regional office. Unfortunately, due to broad Russia invasion and war against Ukraine, we have also losses in our regional offices, and I hope that it's hard to assess the percentage of these losses today, but I hope that these counts of these losses not be increased in the future, and we will be able to preserve all these archival documents. Thanks to the so-called decommissionation law, all these archives open today, and everyone researcher can't work with these documents. So if we try to analyze the role of these of the secret services, I try to show the different type of archival evidence what we preserve in our archives, and that helps us to understand the role of the secret services. First of all, of course, it's a documents of secret paperwork, or in Russian, дело производства. Secondly, it's a regulatory documents, or and then operational documents. The third block is statistical reports, and the last one, but not least, it's criminal files and personal documents. So if we starting to analyze all these blocks of documents, very important information preserved in the document of secret paperwork. It's mainly, if we're talking about our archives, it's a font number 16. It's a documents from Secretariat of GPU to the KGB. These documents include very broad collections regarding Holodomor issues, not only from 30s, but also from 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they show how the different secret services works regarding to the Holodomor issue. Of course, now you can see that slide some part of documents from the 1932. It's the main one of the main task of the secret services. Of course, it's a try to understand what people think, what they talk, what they write to another one, and this information show how the GPU tried to collect information also not about difference, not only anti-Soviet propaganda, but also this information collect from postal censorship measures and others. Also, these documents, in these documents, we preserve not only some reports, but also some evidence what was spread around the Ukraine. For example, it's a different collections and about leaflets what spread during the Ukrainian peasantry in 1932-33, and based on this information collected by the GPU, almost 35,000 of leaflets were confiscated across Soviet Ukraine, and most of these leaflets contained so-called Petlura characters and appeals to started armed rebellion. GPU, of course, marked all these insurgent anti-communist group as Petlura and Petlurivtsi, but not in every time so they really have some connected to real to Ukrainian diaspora organizations from the first Ukrainian independence, from Ukrainian People Republic, or other one. Another type of these documents from Secretariat also shows another documents from the 80s. And these documents, it's mainly informational review and reports of KGB, what KGB sent to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine in the 80s. And these documents help us, and these documents highlight the forms and methods of KGB struggle against spreading the truth about Holodomor, spreading information about the great famine worldwide. To reach the purpose using such methods as falsification, persecution of Soviet and foreign citizens, shifting division into Ukrainian diaspora organizations, and discrediting statesmen and members of parliaments of states that recognize Holodomor and support commemorate events dedicated to the remembrance of the victims. It's mainly in the west part of the world, United States of America, Canada, and also Western Europe. When we moved to another block of documents, it's so-called regulatory documents. It's the different orders, directives, resolutions, and instruction that regulate the work of Soviet secret services. And of course, this kind of documents crucial, important to understanding role and measure of GPU. We have two different inventory. One inventory contains documents from the Soviet Union level, and another one, it's documents from the Republican level. So these both levels help us to understand how GPU work, what how they need to organize different organization and different measures. And now you can saw on your slide, for example, some order to send more personnel to countryside to counteract against the different Kulak organization, against Petlurevщина and so on. What was also interesting, another one documents what we preserve in our archive right now. It's a documents from Crimea. Unfortunately, Crimea now under temporary occupation, but thanks to our archival work, when we moved very important files from regions to Kyiv, we preserve these documents in Kyiv, and we can work with this information now. So it's, for example, it's some telegrams about prohibited and controls the economic situations. It's a telegram prohibits the trade with bread, grain, corn, and meat. So it's also another dimension how the GPU was involved to the commitment, the Holodomor. Another part of documents what we preserve in our archives and that help us understand the role of Soviet secret services, it's so-called operation documents. It's two different collections of fonts in our archives. It's font number 13 and 65. These documents show to us how GPU work against different organization and peoples, and in this case, what I showed to you in the slide, it's a German consulate, and it's very interesting because it's not only German consulate, by different foreign consulate and different foreign offices what exist in a territory of Soviet Ukraine, for example, in Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kyiv. And Chekists try to collect information what the diplomats know about the real situation in Soviet Ukraine, what they wrote in their reports to abroad, to the capitals. And for example, you can saw on your slide some exception from this of one these letters what was sent from Kharkiv to Berlin. It's extremely interesting that a German consulate was penetrated fully and comprehensively. GPU know about everything what happened in a German consulate, and thanks to that, we also know what German diplomats write to the Berlin and how they assess situation in the Soviet Ukraine. And you can, for example, read in this slide about some countermeasure what organized in 1932-33. If we talking about that today, we mentioned that it's like some kind of informational warfare, also called hybrid war, and German diplomats explain and assess some propaganda films what was shooted by Soviets and sent it in a lot of amounts abroad. And in these documents, addition to other informations, we can read that, for example, start citation. It is now established that the famine catastrophe has spread all over Ukraine, and exception are the regions where still left some grain. Judging from available reliable data in Ukrainian villages, have died 80% of populations. It's wrote and citations. It's wrote German diplomats in letter to Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1933, and but regarding to the films called Harvest, they wrote start citations. The film is sent in thousands of copies abroad. It is shown everywhere where the truth about the famine catastrophe on 1932-33 has become a public achievement. and then they write diabolic visit to destroy certain layers of society by organized famine is a historical fact. And citations. These letters was prepared in 1936, and these letters was copied by the GPU and translated to Russians. The another one, and also they show to us how GPU and ACT try to understand what diplomats know about the real situation in Soviet Ukraine. Another block of archival documents what we preserve is statistical reports. They preserve in the fonts number 42, and statistic, for example, this data witnesses about the scale of repression against Ukrainian peasants, category of repressed, forms of resistance of peasants against the policy of communists in 1932-33. Statistic confirms the anti-Ukrainian characters of Holodomor, for example, among all arrested in 1933 because of being member of anti-Soviet parties, 85% were former members of Ukrainian political parties. Also, KPU tried to categorize insurgent activity into main two types. Firstly, it's Ukrainian, it's around 70%, and the last, it's so-called White Guard. The first place in the statistic of reason of the arrest belonged to the paragraph with accusations. It was peasant, so-called peasant counter-revolutions. And of course, another kind, another block of documents that we preserve in our archives, it's so-called criminal files and personal documents. These files today we preserve in two different collections, and if we try to, so they keeping information about mass famine in 1932, 1933 in diaries, personal notes, private letters, photos, handwritten poems, forks, and so on, so on. And what extremely to understand that these documents not cover only the beginning of the 30s, but they started from 1930s. And so documents, files, what related regarding the Holodomor issue started from beginning of 30s, and they moving forward to the end of 80s. So if we try to analyze this huge amount of criminal files, we can find a lot of information during all Soviet times. And for example, if we try to, this huge, firstly, this huge information, what we can find in the criminal files, they show the number of peasant rebellions, the armed insurgency against the communist policy in the countrysides. And for example, according to the documents of GRU, more than 4,000 revolts comprising in Soviet Ukraine, and they involved around 1.2 million people was involved on these movements according to the documents. This rebellion covered different regions, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and others. And in these documents, we can find a photo. It's very rare information when we're talking and discussing about Holodomor times. Also, these documents very broadly show scale and measure of this insurgency against the communists. When you're talking about repression during Holodomor, we can use different type of documents, both like, for example, some regulatory documents. For example, now you can saw the very good known resolution on so-called protection of the socialist property, what was adopted, and the law of 5 years of corn, and according to them, and different instructions have to use these documents. And it's very important to understand that all these orders, what was adopted by the Soviet power in Kremlin, by Stalin and other communist leader, according to different disorders, in the more lowest levels, the different Republican and regional headquarters of the KPU preparing special instruction how the Chekists need to realize these directions on ground. And also, according to another side of the documents, we also preserve the documents with different reports how they realize one or another measure to support Holodomor, the policy of Great Famine on ground. And for example, the very important to us, what very good shows the role of the Soviet secret services. It's a different reports, how they, for example, operate and realize special operation, what will start late November 1962 against so-called enemy elements and this operation covered more than 200 Ukrainian districts. Today, our archives preserved more than 21,000 of criminal files that relate to repression made during 1932-1933 directly. Many of them, it's group files when one cause collected fates of sometimes even hundreds of people. Also, for example, in Ukraine, and this scale of repression, we also can measure it by the numbers of the files and official statistics. For example, in talking about 1932, according to official statistic, over 63,000 of people were arrested by GPU. In the next year, in 1933, over 124,000 of people were arrested in Soviet Ukraine. Mainly, it was so-called counter-revolutionary and peasantry they was accused that they tried to resist against grain taken out, spreading different anti-Soviet propaganda and so on. Also, we can find, but if we analyze and working with personal files or criminal files, it's very important personal testimony we can find in the criminal files. But what is interesting is that, for example, saw the very good known 3 different files from Alexandra Radchenko, Dmytro Zavoloka, and Mykola Bohdan. But what very interesting is that the information about Holodomor times, Holodomor era, what was preserved in the personal evidence in these criminal files, they collected by Soviet secret services in 1937 during Great Terror or Great Purge. And if we mention Alexandra Radchenko, was arrested after Second World War, and their files belonged to the late 40s. So Soviet secret services tried to, so if somebody was accused that they, for example, preserved at their homes diaries with information about Holodomor, like Alexandra Radchenko or Dmytro Zavoloka, and during arrests or during these files was found, these people, according to the huge imprisoned times, if we're talking, for example, according Mykola Bohdan, it's very extremely entire situation because he was a photographer, and it's a very rare photo what belongs to the Holodomor, and what extremely important now, the criminal files about Mykola Bohdan preserved in Chernihiv. Unfortunately, today Chernihiv archives completely destroyed, and only few files was preserved thanks to that it's unique documents, and we moved these files from Chernihiv to Kyiv. Another very interesting and important information preserved in another kind of criminal files. It's repression files about organizers, the census of 1937. These organizers of this census was arrested and repressed because they counted not correct information, not correct numbers of people who live in Soviet Ukraine in 1937, and they show that if Soviet secret service find some information about what really happens and what really counts of people, that was and repression against organizers and executors of the census of 1947 shows that communist secret services tried carefully to hide trace of Holodomor. They destroyed not only documents, but also people who knew important information about demographic losses of Ukrainian population in 1933 and consequences of these demographic losses. So if we try to summarize the role of Soviet secret services based on our archival evidence, I maybe summarize 7 main points. As for me, first of all, it informing Communist Party about public moods, what people thinking and talking about during the Holodomor, but not only during the Holodomor, in another later times also. The second one, it's a control of population movement and control of economy, and we have a lot of different evidence regarding to these points. The third point, it's suppression of so-called enemy elements, and mainly enemy elements before the starting of Holodomor. It's not only so-called Petlurivci, Kulaki or something else, but also repression against Ukrainian intelligentsia. The fourth point, counteraction of peasant uprising and repression during Holodomor against people who try to protest against the different communist measure forward organizing to the Great Famine. The fifth point, it's control over the spread of information about Holodomor, both Soviet Union and abroad. The sixth, it's repression of those who preserved and spread the memory of Holodomor. It's mainly in diaries, in different private conversation and so on. And the seventh, it's last, it's different disinformation campaign and compromising the Holodomor. And this task of the Soviet secret services not finished yet. If we, for example, try to analyze the difference measure of Russia secret services, they also try to organize the same campaign and the same measure, compromising measure against Holodomor issue today. So it's my very short and briefly describing different archival sources, what we preserve in our archives, and how they explain the role and the role of different Soviet secret services and their involving in the organizing Holodomor things.
Okay. Now, as discussant, I'd like to make a few comments, especially on two of the papers. But first of all, I'd like to thank the 4 speakers for all having presented interesting and informative, and in some cases provocative papers. I will begin off with the paper of Bohdan, who is on my right-hand side here. And one of the things he says at the beginning of his paper is that the famine was artificial. What I think it meant by that is that it wasn't caused by meteorological factors. It was caused by the behavior of humanity. It was caused by people. That's no doubt the case. One wouldn't dispute that. The people who thought it was caused by bad harvest in 31 and 32 and the bad weather have retreated. So it was clearly man-made. But there's nothing strange about that. A large number of famines have been man-made. Generally, it's a result of wars. When wars take place, there are often famines. So it's nothing very strange that this should be a man-made famine. But I want to draw attention to one thing that's important, and that's the difference between cause and intent. And that's not hair splitting. It's rather important. You can cause something without intending it. Let me give you a couple of examples. I think I'm right in saying that in the 2 years, 1932 and 1933, the United Kingdom bought 2 million tons of grain from the Soviet Union. That was grain that had been taken from the starving peasants, naturally, and that indicates that countries that imported from grain from the Soviet Union during this period are part of one of the causes of the famine, because it was only because there were countries that were prepared to import grain that the Soviet Union could export it. And it was only because they had to export that was one of the reasons why they had to squeeze the peasants. And if you consider the British imports, they may have contributed a cause to the famine, but they didn't intend to cause a famine. They intended to make a profit out of selling grain to British bakers and other institutions that needed grain. So it's not hair splitting. There is a difference between causing something and intending to do it. And I can give you another example. It concerns the Dutch famine in the winter of 1944-45. That was partly caused by decisions of 3 different organizations. Firstly, the Dutch exile government in London took a decision that had unexpected for them serious adverse consequences. The next party that took decisions that were the cause but were not intended for the cause of famine was the British government, or more precisely the British Army, that did something which was one of the causes of the famine. And the third party involved that did something that was one of the causes was the German occupying forces. So there were 3 different organizations that contributed, were part of the cause of the famine, but none of them actually intended it. Okay, now I'd like to go on to answering one of the questions that was posed by the speaker, by Bohdan, questions deriving from Petrovsky's letter. And one of the question was, question 4, why wasn't grain being brought to Ukraine? That may seem an obvious question in view of the circumstances. Why wasn't grain being brought to Ukraine? But of course, that way of looking at things is to assume that Team Stalin were humanitarians. They were people who, when there were economic problems of the population, would rush to give help. But I can tell you that Team Stalin were not humanitarians. In the first place, as Stalin made it absolutely plain, he regarded many of these peasants as saboteurs. And where sabotage is taking place, what do? You beat the people. You certainly don't give them bread. So as it follows from them regarding them as saboteurs, because why were they saboteurs? Because they haven't delivered the grain that was necessary for Stalin's industrialization program. So they were saboteurs. All they deserved was beating, certainly not food. And then it's clear from Stalin's exchange of letters to Sholokhov that he thought he was engaged in a war of attrition with the peasants. And if you're engaged in a war, you certainly don't supply your enemy with food, you beat them. And then there's a speech of Stalin from, I think, at the beginning of 1933, where he talks about the idle. And there are people apparently with some economic difficulties in the Soviet Union, but they're idlers. And why do we know they're idlers? Because they haven't supplied the grain that we need for our procurements. So it's the idlers. And what do you do about idlers? They deserve to die. He made that in a speech, rather dramatic, but it's not much commented on. Yes, and there's one other thing that I also draw attention to. When you're thinking about the millions of people who died and why the government didn't do something to improve the situation or to prevent it in the first place, you have to bear in mind what the political leaders had just gone through. If you take the period from 1914 to 1922, that was a continuous period of excess deaths over normal situations, first because of the First World War, then because of the Civil War, then because of serious epidemic diseases, and then of a famine, a big one in 1921-22. And it's been calculated in a well-known paper by Mark Harrison and Andriy Markovich that the excess deaths on USSR territory in the interwar period from those catastrophes was about 13 million, a lot more than the number who died in the famine of 32-33. So the leadership of the Soviet Union were people who lived through millions of deaths, and they regarded it as just one of those things of life. And it didn't call immediately for action from them. Okay. Right. Well, that's all I want to say about Bogdan's paper. But I'm sure he's quite right, and it's rather important that Molotov's visit to Ukraine had serious adverse consequences for the people of Ukraine. That's absolutely right, and it's worth pointing it out and drawing attention to various details. As for the statistics in the paper, well, I could comment on those, but it would take me too long, so I'll leave that for the time being. I just want to comment on one other paper. That is the paper by Antanas here on my left about Lithuania. Well, that was certainly an interesting paper, but of course, the fact that agriculture and food supplies in parts of the Soviet Union got difficult and led to shortages and difficulties with feeding people. That's nothing exclusive to Lithuania, of course. In the whole history of the Soviet Union, it was rather common that here or there would be a shortage of food and difficulties of agriculture. So it's important for Lithuanian history, and it's an interesting thing, but it's certainly not unique. As for the political conclusions that you might draw right at the end about the importance of individual effort, what's said here? Oh yes, that the only way to solve the problems of socialism was to rely on individual free will. Well, that's rather politicized, I would say, because if you look at agriculture in the Western world, you'll find that it's very heavily subsidized. Lithuania is now part of the EU, and I assume that Lithuanian agriculture is regulated by the Common Agricultural Policy. A friend of mine, Mario Nuti, an Italian economist who specialized in communist economies, he once said that the Common Agricultural Policy is an island of central planning in an ocean of the market economy. And it's certainly true that the Common Agricultural Policy does regulate agriculture quite extensively, and agriculture is something which you can't leave to individuals. It requires a suitable institutional framework, normally worked out by nation states or groups of nation states. Okay, thank you very much.
To address the comments by Michael, we just briefly oversay because we are pushing back against time.
Can I go ahead?
Would you like to address the comments by Michael, your discussant?
Just briefly, I didn't emphasize enough in the paper, I think, the national aspect, which I'd like to do right now. Of course, there was a war against the peasantry as a whole, but here in this particular case, I would argue that the arrows are pointing of a war against Ukraine in particular. And the Molotov mission, I think, reflects that to some degree. The excessive procurements from Ukraine in a situation where the authorities knew that taking more grain would cause even more suffering, they went ahead and did it anyway, which of course does prove some intent. And and I think Petrovsky's letter reveals again a difference between the approach of the Kremlin leaders and the Ukrainian leaders. He explicitly states in the letter that I would like to help, but I can't, meaning that his hands are tied. That reflects, in my view, that the Ukrainian leadership was prepared to be a bit softer in their approach to the peasants and not beat them over the head to their death, so to speak. But they were still communists, but they weren't quite as communist or quite as ruthless, quite as brutal, quite as bad as Joseph Stalin. So I'd like to stop there and give other people a chance to talk.
May I just say one thing about this? There is a paper which I think most people here will know, but in case there's anybody who doesn't know, which confirms the Ukrainian aspect of the matter. It's a paper by Andriy Markovich, Natalia Naumenko, and Nancy Krian, and it's called The Political Economic Causes of the Soviet Great Famine of 1932-33. It's been made available on the internet, on the website of the New Economic School in Moscow, and on the website of the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States. And it's well worth reading, but I must say it's full of statistics, and those people who like literary history won't find it very easy to study. But if you're interested in the statistics, and if you're interested in evidence for this being a genocidal famine, then look in this paper, because it's got a lot of evidence precisely to support that interpretation.
Antanas, a quick comment?
Just a few words. I completely agree that I could have chosen my words towards the end more carefully, and I'm really not claiming that the Lithuanian experience is somewhat unique, though I see it as an interesting topic, well, obviously, because I come from there, but I think that there are certain aspects that I was unable to show in greater detail, but yeah, just that's it.
Thank you. Maksym?
Thank you for reading out my paper. I have no comments.
Okay. Well, thank you to our presenters and to Michael Ellman for your commentary. We, as we have been for the past 2 days, we are running behind. So what I suggest that we do now, because I'm sure there are lots of questions, and we should continue this conversation, I think, in an informal manner. We've pushed back our keynote by Snihyr till about 4:15, which gives us about 15 minutes to get a quick coffee, use the restroom, and then come back here and get ready for what will be not only the keynote for our second day, but will be the conclusion to our second day of the conference.